Our reading is from Psalm 32, and it's the whole thing. Psalm 32, a maskil of David. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me, and my strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Selah. I acknowledged my sin to you. I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Selah. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Selah. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Be not like a horse or mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but the steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. So this is a psalm, and we are going to take a look at this psalm in a moment. But first, I want to talk in general about psalms, because psalms are a particular type of literature. In the Bible, we have all sorts of types of literature. We have poetry, we have psalms, we have parables, we have historical narrative, we have apocalyptic literature, which is a dream language, and we're starting a Bible study on Revelation next Wednesday, speaking of apocalyptic literature. That would be the Wednesday following September 10th, 2017, of course. But what I want to do today is sort of take a moment to think about Psalms and what they are and how they work in us, because they work a little differently than, say, reading about Jesus in the Gospels. They work a lot more like poetry than prose. They work a lot more like a song than a speech. And so not that everything, I think, in the scriptures works both on our heart and our mind, of course, because we have these different pieces to us, but we're not like a strict, like a dichotomy, and our heart and our mind are completely severed. They all go together in a system. But I think that I would like to assert to you that the Psalms speak more to the heart and the spirit than they do to the mind. In fact, I think I would say it this way. Things like the record of what Jesus did, the historical narrative, and Jesus' parables, things like that, they get to the spirit or the heart by going through the mind. You think and you understand that it affects you in your heart and your spirit. Psalms, I think, are more like songs and poetry. They of course want to affect your mind, but they get to your mind by going through your heart and your spirit. And this is important because what this means is you have to read them differently. You don't read them like a manual on how to live or an instruction list or something like that. You read them and try and connect with them the way your heart speaks and feels when your passions are aroused. And I don't mean that in a non-sexual way, but I don't mean that in a sexual way either. I just mean that like when your emotions are aroused and you're like really feeling something, right? You feel something very strongly, whether it's love or anger or jealousy or whatever it is. So Psalms try to connect with you in those kind of heart ways, and whether or not it's that whole heart that's overflowing or it's that broken heart that's either like torn with rage or it's torn with hurt or whatever. And so the first thing I'm going to give you a few verses here that just kind of help you see what I'm talking about, because Psalms, also as a kind of a poetic language, use a lot of things, turns of phrases, ways of speaking that are not literal. They use metaphor and simile. They overstate things to make the case. Hyperbole, that would be called, now that I can think of the word. And so I'm going to give you a few just single verses from Psalms that I think illustrate for you what I'm talking about. And the first one, the next one I'm going to show you, it might be it might be one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. Not because I like what it said, but I like the purity with which it speaks to the times when we might find ourselves consumed with anger. Listen to this. It's Psalm 139, verse 22. I hate them with perfect hatred. You can't tell me that's not awesome. You can't tell me that's not awesome. Now David's writing that, and he's talking about the people who speak, who lie about God and things like that, right? But listen, he's like, I don't just hate them. I hate them with perfect hatred. It's just fantastic, and you know, you can't tell me you haven't felt that at times, and I don't know what arouses that sense of hatred in you, whether it's abuse of power or a lack of compassion or what. I don't know what gets to you like that, but you can't tell me you haven't had times where, if you were going to really let yourself go, and this is one thing we find in the Psalms, is an idea of sort of letting our heart speak, right? You can't tell me there haven't been a few times where in your life you almost could say you hate something with perfect hatred. It's just awesome. All right. Anyway, it's all downhill from here. No, that's not true. But here we go. The next one, this next one, Psalm 140, verse 10, also speaks of that time when you feel like people are against you or something, or they're against good or something. And your heart just says, let burning coals fall upon them. Let them be cast into the fire, into the deep pits. They don't rise up again. Psalm 140, verse 10. So there are times when you see things happen, or you hear of people who do things or don't do things they should, and your heart just really desires their downfall. And of course, as we grow in Christ, our spirits get coached by the Word and empowered by the Spirit to love our enemies, right? And love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. That is what Jesus called us to do. But Jesus is calling us through his Word to a restored heart. And yet we have these Psalms that speak to the inclinations of our hearts. And I did hear I heard one speaker talk about using these when you're angry at somebody. Obviously, you don't use them like straight at them, and you're not saying them to their face, but you insert the person's name in the psalm. Like if you're so upset at Michael, you're like, let burning coals fall on Michael. Let Michael be cast into the fire and deep pits, and let Michael not rise again, because you're just so mad at him or whatever. But this speaker said what happens when you do that is you begin to burn out the anger, that the scriptures the anger fizzles out as you give voice to what is in fact really going on in your heart. You open it up to be drained like a pimple, drained like a boil. Get that stuff out of there. Don't just try and shove it down. You let it out, and that's where the peace comes from, he would say. So I think that's an interesting thought, and I'd be interested to hear from you about what you think about that. Psalm 69, verse 1-2. We're facing a hurricane, so this seems particularly appropriate. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I have come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. Now, of course, facing a hurricane, I see this literally. That's what comes to my mind, right? Floodwaters. But of course, the psalmist here is just kind of writing about his life. And if you went to the context, you might find it's people persecuting him. You might find it's things going wrong. It might just be like, have you ever had those times where you're just, it seems like everything's happening at once and you're like just barely keeping your head above water in your life? So this is a prayer for those kind of things. And it's an acknowledgement that that's the way we feel sometimes. And then the next one I'm going to show you is a refrain that is repeated over and over in the Psalms in many places. And I think that it's a refrain that our hearts certainly can resonate with, even though in the end, the answer is faith. It's Psalm 79, verse 5. That's what I'm going to show you. And the piece of it I'm showing you is this. How long, O Lord? How long? And you can't tell me that you haven't said, how long, Lord? If you're a person who prays and, looks to God and that kind of thing, you certainly have said, how long, Lord? And I have said, how long, Lord? And again, it's the after you let your heart say it, the response of your heart, and this is what you find if you read through the Psalms as a whole psalm, you find that the response of the heart after the pouring out of what's going on is always the turn. It's kind of got the turn of faith written into the psalm, where yet will I praise you, or yet will I trust you, or one day I will see the vindication of the Lord, or whatever like that. So the Psalms pour out what's going on, whether or not it's that anger, I hate them with perfect hatred, or it's that sort of sinking and things are tough, like I'm up to my neck, and you're saying, how long, O Lord? So it gives voice to those things that we all feel. And that's one of the reasons Psalms are important. And it's important to read them as Psalms and not just study them like a book. You got to read them and if there was a way you could read with your heart instead of your eyes, that would be a good thing, because then your heart would see it, and your heart would resonate with what the psalmist is saying. Now, the Psalms aren't all hate with perfect hatred and sinking in the mire. Of course, there's times when your heart rejoices too, and the Psalms speak to those as well. Psalm 122, verse 1. I was glad when they said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Psalm 30, verse 5. His anger is but for a moment, his favor is for life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And so that's for those times when, something's going on, but you want to remind yourself that it's temporary. Psalm 62, verses 5 to 6. My soul, wait silently for God alone, for my expectation is from him. He is my rock and salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. So those are those, I'm sure you've had those wait patiently times in your life, and you're just kind of there. You're kind of doing what you need to do, and you're just kind of getting through it, right? And you're waiting. Now, you might need to make a decision or something. I don't know. We don't want to go into all that right now. But there are psalms about this kind of feeling where it's time, you're in a waiting time. And the last one I'm going to show you, just to kind of give you a sense of all these things. This is from actually last week's sermon where I was talking about the eclipse. And it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. And what that's talking about is just how we see the glory of God in the beauty of creation. And that can change the way you see things. It can change the way you see trees and plants and the moon and sunsets and lakes and sand on the beach. When you start to see through the creation to the creator. And when you see something that moves you with beauty, you let yourself be moved with beauty, and you move through that, let your mind move through that to praise the one who created this thing of beauty. So that's Psalms in general. Psalms in general speaking to the heart. Now we want to go specifically to Psalm 32. And Psalm 32, it says, is a maskil of David. And let's start with that word maskil. And, something happened. There we go. to start with the word maskil, right there. We have no idea what that means. It might, it could be many different things. I'm going to erase that. There we go. It could be many different things. It could mean to be played with skill. There's 13 psalms that are called maskils, and it might be that they need to be played with a special skill. It might mean that they need to be played with a special depth of meaning or contemplation. You know how some people are more technical on their instrument, and some people are more musicians. That's what I would call it. There's some people who can hit all the right notes in all the right time, and then there are others who take you to a whole different place with the way they play the instrument. And it could be that maskil means you need to get somebody like that to accompany this. It could even be just a technical word describing this type of the construction of this thing or the way it's performed, kind of like we say we're going to hear a cantata or a concerto or something like that. So, but let's pick this apart a little bit, okay? I am going to get a pointer here, I think, so that those of you who are watching can watch along. And I'll describe what I'm doing. So the first two verses begin with the word blessed. And these are couplets, and that's one of the things we see in poetry is things sort of grouped. Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme the way English poetry does because Hebrew is an inflected language like Spanish. So it's easy, too easy really, to make things rhyme. Like the ending for we in Spanish is almost, right? So as long as you end in a word that uses that ending, it rhymes with the next one. So in a lot of languages, rhyming is not the big deal for poetry. It's more about meter and structure and use of language and things like that. So in Psalm 32, we have the first little couplet here is about being blessed. Okay, so let's see, verse 1 and 2. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. So this is the setup for the whole psalm. This is really what the psalm is about, how wonderful it is. Blessed is where like God is smiling on you, right? Blessed is where things are in harmony. Things feel good. You got the groove going, right? That's you know those times in your life when things are humming, right? That's kind of blessed. Things are humming in the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. The one who's against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit, wakes up feeling peaceful and joyful and at harmony with the world. That's kind of what's going on with these first two verses here. I want to we're going to key off this last little phrase here. We got the blessed, and no sin, right? Sins covered, all that stuff. And then the psalmist makes this little turn here, in whose spirit there is no deceit. No deceit. That little phrase right there is where he's going to turn on. He's going to take you to a new place, because all of a sudden he's been talking about sin, deceit. And that's what he's really going to get at with this psalm. And so let's move forward to verses 3 and 4 to go where he is really going to go with this psalm. What this psalm really speaks to is these particular times of deceit in our lives. And it might be self-deceit, and it might be deceit of others, and it might be trying to deceive God, or at least not admit to God. So this is Psalm 32, verse 3 and 4. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Selah. Now, I don't know what Selah means either. It seems to be some sort of like pause thing or something. I think the modern thing might be beat. Right? This is a beat. You pause there. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. And then you move on. So let's talk for a moment about that, about keeping silent. Well, actually, I'm going to read verse 5, the last verse in the first part of this. This particular psalm is divided into two parts. Part 5 is what he's keeping silent about. Remember, in the beginning, it was blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, sin. And then verse 5 is about when I acknowledged my sin, right? So between sin in the first verse and sin in the fifth verse, we are led into verses 3 and 4 by the word deceit. So verses 3 and 4 is when I kept silent. My bones wasted away all day long. When I wouldn't talk about my sin, when I was unwilling to admit my sin, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. And they're an agricultural society. Not that, I mean, we all depend on agriculture, but they actually were agrarian and lived with it, and everybody knew how to grow things and stuff. So they would know exactly what plants look like when they haven't gotten the water and they begin to like wilt, and they kind of, the leaves curl up and the stalk begins to bend over, and it just looks kind of dry and brittle. David is saying, that's what your spirit feels like when you conceal your sin. And he would know, because he had some doozies. So why does somebody keep silent? Why does somebody conceal their sin? Why would somebody endure this wasting of bones and groaning and feeling the heavy hand of the Lord? Well, I can think of a couple things. One is pride. And pride, of course, takes us back to the devil's sin. And pride actually takes us back to the Garden of Eden, too, where Adam and Eve had one basic instruction: don't eat that fruit. And Satan tempted Eve, and her pride got the better of her. And when I say pride, I mean that she thought, and together with Adam, they both decided that they knew better about the fruit than God did, and they could decide for themselves what was right. Unfortunately, even though God had warned them, they decided for themselves, and the consequences is our whole world fallen into sin. And so one of the things that keeps us from admitting our sin is pride. I don't know if you've ever been in an argument with somebody, and halfway through the argument, it kind of dawns on you that the other person is right. But by that time, you're kind of invested, aren't you? You've kind of gone a little ways down that road. You have put down some roots in your position. Maybe you've said some things that would not taste very good if you had to eat them. And so your pride keeps you from acknowledging where you're wrong. But in a relationship, the pride of not being able to admit where you're wrong will do this to your relationship, because this is a universal truth. We're going to get to your relationship with God in a moment, but this thing's a universal truth. If you keep silent about sin in your relationship, things that have destroyed the shalom, the harmony between you and somebody else, that relationship is going to waste away in groaning. That relationship is going to be dried up as by the heat of summer. And so that's the first thing I would encourage you to think about as we are going through this psalm together, is in what relationships is pride maybe starving that relationship? In what where is your pride, your unwillingness to admit your error or your weakness? Where in your relationships is that drying up the relationship like a plant in the heat of summer? In what relationship do you find that the relationship is wasting away a little bit because of your pride? So that's one thing, pride. Another thing it takes us again back to the Garden of Eden. Everything seems to go back to the Garden of Eden. is another reason we don't want to admit our sin. Another reason we choose to deceive either ourselves or others or God about our sin is that we want to hide. We want to hide because we have shame about what's going on. And that takes us back to the Garden of Eden. Remember Adam and Eve, it says they were naked and knew no shame. And then the very next incident is the fall into sin. And suddenly they're hiding from God. For the very first time after they ate of the fruit that they were not supposed to taste, they found themselves hiding from the one whose presence before had always caused them joy. This time it caused them to run and hide because they were ashamed, because they were naked. And they tried to make clothes for themselves, but it ended up God was kind and compassionate to them and made clothes for them and also promised a coming Messiah. That's a whole nother sermon, though. So the question is, where do you have shame? If you deal with a lot of shame, I would suggest a particular author. Her name is Brené Brown, and believe it or not, she is a shame researcher, but she has so much wisdom on shame. And the thing with shame is that our natural result with shame is to hide it. But when we hide the things we're ashamed about, our bones waste away, and our spirits groan, and the hand of the world is heavy on us, and our strength is dried up. And you know this about living with shame. And so whether or not it's the thing with pride or the thing that makes you hide, the answer's the same. It's not to get stronger and tougher. You don't like get stronger. You don't dig in your heels on your position when you're wrong. You don't try to further bury your shame. In both of these instances, verse 5 of Psalm 32 tells us what to do. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Selah. Beat. So, this psalm is specifically about David's relationship to God. But before we go there, just want to point out the thing that stopped the wasting, stopped the groaning, rehydrated the spirit, and lifted the heavy hand was not further strength. It was confession. I did not cover. And that's what opened it up. And so if you're in a relationship somewhere and pride is wasting that away, or shame is wasting that away, the key is not to just suck it up buttercup. The key is acknowledgement and confession. Now, there are certain things that you might need to go, depending on the relationship, you might want to find someone else confess to. AA has this saying, we're only as sick as our secrets. You don't need to tell your private stuff to everybody, but you need somebody who knows your private stuff. No one's ever going to know you completely because you're an individual mind. But you need someone who knows your private stuff so that you don't have to play these mind games and just hold it all in and let your bones waste away and groan and feel the heavy hand and be dried up in your spirit. So that is a truth in our relationships, but it's a truth with God too. And that's where David is going with this psalm, is because all sin in the end is sin against God. And so when he tried to be deceitful and pretend he wasn't sinful, his bones wasted away and all that stuff. And then he turned and he said, I acknowledged my sin to you. I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Selah. when he turned and confessed, the wasting was rejuvenated, the groaning was stopped, the heavy hand was lifted, and the dried up strength was renewed. And it wasn't through perfection, it was through confession. These we've already described of what happened in the Garden of Eden that this psalm describes, and God is undoing that through Jesus Christ. And he wants to undo that both in your relationships with other people to release you from the shackles of shame and pride. And he also wants to undo it in your relationship with him. He wants you to feel the release of confession, because that's where the peace is. The peace is not in perfection. The peace is in confession. And I will tell you this, just one story before we move on, because I've seen this at work. I knew somebody who that I'd been talking to for a long time, probably a couple years, that was really just trapped by a particular thing. And to my shame, it took me 2 years to get to the tool of the Christian, the tool of the pastor, instead of just, I played amateur counselor or therapist for 2 years, trying to help this person move past this thing that was not a healthy part of this person's life. And really, it was 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. It was that doing it in your own effort thing. And then one day, if I could have kicked myself in the head, I would have. I didn't. But what I did is pulled out that confession and absolution. And so with this person, we did confession and absolution. And it broke the power of that thing in a way that all the other thinking and talking through and everything else just never did. It was simply the confession and forgiveness that began to lift the heavy hand of that thing. And this is a thing AA also knows. It is one of the first things you have to admit as part of that process is your powerlessness. And we all face that. We all have things we're powerless over. And if you try to be deceitful about that, your bones are going to waste away. You're going to groan. You're going to feel a heavy hand on you, and your strength is going to dry up. But if you can hear verse 5, that when you confess your sins and you don't cover up your iniquity, God forgives and the load is lifted. If you can hear that and let that move you to a place of greater openness and authenticity in your life is going to be sweeter and more joyful. And that's where the second half of this psalm goes. So let's go there now. Therefore, so that's the first 5 verses were the first half, right? Not exactly the first half, but the first chunk of the psalm. We talked about that. And then therefore, so now we've switched into the second half. Therefore, and we're going to go through this part more quickly in case you're wondering. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer a prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Selah. So that's another couplet there. So in the first half we had 2 couplets and then that concluding verse, and we're going to see a similar but not exactly the same pattern here. So this is all about, therefore, because what David discovered about confession, which is what opens you up to healing and joy and peace and all that stuff. This is what David proclaims. He says, therefore, let everybody pray to you while they can, because what he found was God was not the judge who was waiting to put the hammer down. God was the forgiver. And so in verse 7, he says, you are a hiding place. You preserve me. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Then in verse 8 and 9, there's actually a voice switch. And this happens in several psalms. This becomes the voice of God here for 2 verses, speaking to David. Or it could be David speaking to other people of what he has experienced. Either one works there. And you have to kind of flow with it because it's a poem, right? Verse 8 says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Be not like a horse or a mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. So whether or not this is God speaking to us or David speaking to us out of his experience to instruct us in the ways of God, he's telling us that he wants to instruct us as people who will listen based on his testimony of what he experienced with his hiding of his sin and then confession of his sin. And he says, don't be like a mule where the only thing that keeps you there is force. Don't be without understanding. Listen, get it. And you know, and you can almost hear him saying, listen, you know this is true. You've experienced this in little ways here and there when you've admitted things, and it feels good. It feels good to just let it go. I mean, kids learn this too. As they mature, they learn that it's, most of them anyways, at most times, learn that it's better to just admit it and take your punishment and move on. And so that's what David is saying here. He wants to instruct us, or it's God instructing him and all of us to be like people with understanding. Don't be like an animal that has to be like forced into everything. Listen. And then he concludes with a couple of verses here that sort of paint the picture for us. Many are the sorrows of the wicked. Those are the ones who maintain that deceit, right? But steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. And that trust in the Lord is the trust to be open, to not conceal your sin, but to confess openly before the Lord. So he ends up saying, be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. So we're closing up the sermon here and moving on. Do you need to let go of pride anywhere? Do you need to stop the hiding or not let shame have the upper hand in your life in somewhere? Do you need to move into that shame and just face it openly? And when you do, you come out into the place of shouting for joy. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we have read this psalm, and it is a beautiful psalm, a psalm that wants to give us the freedom of joy and lightness of heart. I want to pray for everybody listening, no matter where or when they are listening, that you would show them where pride is keeping them from openly confessing their sin, or where shame is making them hide, motivating them to hide instead of confessing their sin. I ask you, God, to grant them your Spirit to draw them toward confession so they can experience the lightness of being that comes with it, so they can experience when the heaviness is lifted and the forgiveness comes. They can experience you as a hiding place and a gentle instructor. Father, I commend anybody who hears this to you. In Jesus' name, amen.